Henry Kissinger's views on Russia and Ukraine evolved across a century marked by global upheaval, as he navigated a world defined by great power politics. Born in Germany in 1923, during the last breaths of Lenin's Soviet Union, and just before Hitler's rise, Kissinger experienced firsthand the seismic shifts that would shape his worldview. As a Jewish child fleeing Nazi persecution, Kissinger's early life was marked by the brutal realities of power and conflict. By 1953, when Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died, Kissinger was already honing the ideas that would dominate his approach to international relations, grounded in realpolitik. His intellectual journey began with his doctoral dissertation, later published as A World Restored in 1957, which examined European politics after the Napoleonic Wars. In this work, Kissinger argued that a legitimate world order arises from an unspoken agreement between great powers about what is permissible in terms of foreign policy. For Kissinger, legitimacy was not synonymous with justice, but rather with a pragmatic balance of power that would maintain stability, even at the expense of moral or ethical ideals. This philosophy became the cornerstone of his political career and remained relevant until his passing at the age of 100. Henry Kissinger's post-Cold War struggles reflect the profound complexity of a world in transition, particularly as the dissolution of the Soviet Union reshaped global power dynamics and left behind a fragmented geopolitical landscape. The rise of Russian President Vladimir Putin, with whom Kissinger held numerous meetings, and the increasingly fraught relations between Russia and Ukraine revealed limitations in Kissinger's realpolitik worldview. In a July 2022 interview with Der Spiegel, Kissinger found himself grappling with how to frame the ongoing war in Ukraine. When asked to draw an instructive historical parallel to help understand and possibly resolve the conflict, he hesitated, admitting, "Right off the top of my head, I cannot give a direct answer." His difficulty was telling. Kissinger saw the Ukraine war not only as a classic geopolitical struggle for balance of power, but also as a hybrid conflict that transcended such simplistic definitions. He acknowledged that it had aspects of a civil war, while combining elements of European-style international crises with broader global consequences. Kissinger further speculated that the outcome of the conflict would determine Russia's future orientation. Would it achieve the long-sought goal of a coherent relationship with Europe? Or would it be reduced to becoming an outpost of Asia at the border of Europe? His inability to find a historical parallel pointed to the unprecedented nature of the conflict, where long-standing European power dynamics collided with modern global complexities. There is no good historical example, he ultimately concluded, a rare admission from a man known for his sweeping historical analyses. However, many experts argue that Kissinger's emphasis on strategic balance among global powers clouded his judgment, particularly in moments of seismic change. Paul Goebel, a retired CIA analyst and expert on former Soviet republics, noted that such a realist approach may work in normal times, but it inevitably fails to capture the possibilities of change or what happens when change begins. Goebel suggested that Kissinger's rigid focus on state actors and great power diplomacy blinded him to the power of popular movements and the agency of smaller nations. This framework, while effective during periods of relative stability, faltered in moments of upheaval, such as the collapse of the Soviet Union, a pivotal event Kissinger failed to foresee. Kissinger's analytical blind spot extended to Ukraine itself. Ukrainian academic Petro Kralyuk argued in a June essay for RFE/RL's Ukrainian service that Kissinger consistently underestimated Ukraine's significance. Kralyuk pointed out that Kissinger's 1994 book Diplomacy, a comprehensive work on global politics, mentioned Ukraine only twice, an omission that underscored his tendency to view Eastern Europe primarily through the lens of great power competition, rather than acknowledging the autonomy and aspirations of smaller nations like Ukraine. Ukrainian academic Petro Kralyuk underscores a crucial aspect of Henry Kissinger's outlook in his limited references to Ukraine, especially in his 1994 book Diplomacy. The first mention, Kralyuk notes, comes in Kissinger's approval of US President George Bush's infamous 1991 Chicken Kiev speech. Delivered to the Ukrainian parliament, Bush warned against suicidal nationalism and urged Ukraine to pursue freedom, democracy and economic reform within Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's framework for a new Union treaty. At the time, Bush's speech was seen as a plea to preserve the Soviet Union in some form, signaling the West's reluctance to embrace the full independence of Ukraine and other Soviet republics. The second reference to Ukraine in Kissinger's diplomacy is perhaps more revealing. In a passage Kralyuk finds particularly significant, Kissinger writes, "The vast majority of leading figures in Russia, regardless of their political beliefs, refuse to recognize the collapse of the Soviet Empire or the legitimacy of the successor states, especially Ukraine, the cradle of Russian orthodoxy." To Kralyuk, this thesis reveals Kissinger's implicit alignment with a Russian worldview that sees Ukraine as inextricably linked to Russia, both culturally and historically. Kissinger's framing of Ukraine as the cradle of Russian orthodoxy suggests that he viewed Ukraine's independence as a challenge to Russia's historical identity, implicitly validating Moscow's refusal to fully accept the sovereignty of former Soviet republics like Ukraine. Kralyuk argues that Kissinger's perspective aligns with the mindset of Russian politicians who continue to see Ukraine as fundamentally intertwined with Russia's past and future. This lens, he suggests, blinded Kissinger to the growing sense of Ukrainian national identity and its aspirations for independence, particularly in the post-Soviet world. By framing Ukraine's independence as a historical anomaly rather than an evolution of national self-determination, Kissinger may have underestimated the power of this emerging national identity and its resistance to Russian influence. Throughout most of Vladimir Putin's tenure, Kissinger consistently advocated for a cooperative relationship with Moscow. In January 2018, he reiterated this position during a US Senate committee hearing, stressing the importance of maintaining dialogue with Russia. Kissinger's firm, Kissinger Associates, had long-standing ties with the Kremlin, and during much of Putin's reign, the Russian government was reportedly a client. This relationship goes back to the early 1990s, when Kissinger first met Putin, who was then working in the administration of St. Petersburg Mayor Anatoly Sobchak. Putin's role in the bilateral Kissinger-Sobchak Commission to promote Western investment in Russia marked the beginning of a working relationship that would endure for decades. Janusz Bugajski, a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation in Washington, D.C., offers a sharp critique of Henry Kissinger's approach to Russia, characterizing him as an apologist for Muscovite imperialism. Bugajski argues that Kissinger's worldview was mired in Cold War-era thinking, positioning Russia as a great power with an inherent right to dominate its sphere of influence. This perspective, he contends, led Kissinger to largely ignore the aspirations and interests of smaller or newly emerging states, such as Ukraine, which sought independence from Moscow's grip. Kissinger himself acknowledged the complexities of dealing with Russia. In a 2016 interview with The Atlantic, he remarked, "It is not possible to bring Russia into the international system by conversion." Instead, he advocated for deal-making with the Kremlin, stressing the need to engage Russia with a mixture of strategic firmness and historical understanding. He argued that while Russia's military options should be limited, this should be done in a way that preserved its dignity, acknowledging its unique societal and historical trajectory. Kissinger believed that Russia's identity, shaped by centuries of imperialism and its vast geographic expanse, required special diplomatic handling, a stance that, to many critics, revealed a blind spot for the rights and sovereignty of smaller nations in Russia's orbit. Kissinger's position on Ukraine became particularly controversial following Moscow's 2014 annexation of Crimea and its support for separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. Despite Russia's overt aggression, Kissinger appeared to remain committed to his view that Ukraine was inherently tied to Russia's sphere of influence. In a commentary for The Washington Post, published less than a month after the Crimea seizure, Kissinger underscored this perspective by writing that, "To Russia, Ukraine can never be just a foreign country." He urged Ukrainian leaders to pursue reconciliation between the different parts of their country, implicitly acknowledging the internal divisions exacerbated by Russian intervention. His statement that Ukraine should not join NATO reflected his belief that Ukraine's alignment with Western powers could dangerously provoke Russia, further entrenching the conflict. In a 2015 interview with the National Interest, Kissinger highlighted the deep and complex historical ties between Ukraine and Russia, stating, "The relationship between Ukraine and Russia will always have a special character in the Russian mind. It can never be limited to a relationship of two traditional sovereign states, not from the Russian point of view, maybe not even from Ukraine's." This perspective revealed Kissinger's long-standing belief that Ukraine, due to its deep cultural and historical entanglement with Russia, could never be viewed as merely an independent nation in the eyes of Moscow. The implication was clear. Russia would always view Ukraine through a different lens, and perhaps Ukraine too was tied to this notion, whether it acknowledged it or not. This sentiment was echoed in his 2016 speech in Moscow, where Kissinger proposed that Ukraine should function as a bridge between Russia and the West, rather than as an outpost of either side. His vision for Ukraine was a neutral mediator, balancing between the two powerful blocs rather than aligning fully with either. To him, this was the path to stability. However, such a position struck many in Ukraine as deeply problematic, as it overlooked their desire for autonomy and their growing orientation toward the West. Even as the conflict in Ukraine escalated, Kissinger's calls for diplomacy remained cautious. In May 2022, as Russia's brutal full-scale invasion unfolded, he urged for a ceasefire and a return to the line of contact as it had stood prior to Russia's February offensive. This suggestion was widely interpreted in Ukraine as a call for Kiev to relinquish its claim to Crimea, the peninsula Russia had annexed in 2014. Despite the backlash, Kissinger clarified in a July 2022 interview with Der Spiegel that he saw Crimea's future as a topic for further negotiation, not an immediate concession. Yet for many Ukrainians, Kissinger's proposal was viewed as a concession to Russian aggression, feeding into the narrative of appeasement rather than standing firm against Moscow's imperial ambitions. However, as the war dragged on and Russia's actions became more aggressive, Kissinger's perspective began to shift. By January 2023, speaking at the Davos World Economic Forum, he expressed admiration for the President of Ukraine and for the heroic conduct of the Ukrainian people. This marked a notable change in tone, showing his growing respect for Ukraine's resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. His evolving views culminated in a September meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, where Kissinger openly acknowledged that the course of the war had reshaped his understanding. "Before this war, I was opposed to the membership of Ukraine in NATO because I feared that it would start the very process that we are seeing now," he admitted to Zelensky. But with the ongoing Russian aggression, Kissinger concluded that the idea of a neutral Ukraine under these conditions no longer makes sense. In this moment, Kissinger conceded that the geopolitical landscape had shifted irrevocably, and the notion of a neutral Ukraine, once a cornerstone of his realpolitik approach, was no longer feasible in the current climate. Kissinger's change in stance underscored the profound impact of the war, not just on Ukraine, but on the broader global order. The once unthinkable, Kissinger endorsing the integration of Ukraine into NATO, was now a reality. His evolving views mirrored the larger geopolitical reckoning happening across the world, as nations grappled with the consequences of unchecked Russian aggression. What once seemed like a balanced approach, advocating for Ukraine as a neutral bridge between Russia and the West, now felt inadequate in the face of Ukraine's fierce fight for sovereignty. Ultimately, Kissinger's journey from cautious diplomacy to a more full-throated support for Ukraine's independence and defense highlighted the complexities of navigating international relations in a rapidly changing world. His legacy, while controversial, remains a testament to the difficulty of balancing great power politics with the realities faced by smaller nations caught in the crosshairs of history.